I'm going to date myself, and I hope not embarrass our amazing guests too much, but I guess that Dave Callaway and I must have known each other for, 30 years, I would say, at least. We'll leave it at 30. But this guy is really a journalist, if I ever knew one. We first stumbled across each other at Bloomberg News, but he'd already been a reporter for years, starting at the old Herald in Boston, a paper I grew up with as a kid. I remember that so well. They actually covered the old Boston Braves, believe it or not. But as with many of us, it was only after we went over the wall and escaped Bloomberg that we really began to bloom. Are there any Bloomberg people in here? Okay. Anyway, the founding editor of MarketWatch in San Francisco, then Callaway took over USA Today as editor-in-chief and took it from something that got dropped in front of the door of your room at the Holiday Inn into the 21st century with a digital presence on every continent. I guess the digital presence has to be on every continent anyway, doesn't it? But Dave just couldn't let well enough alone. There were more mountains to conquer. And what's more of a mountain than CNBC's Jim Cramer, one of history's greatest stock pickers, but no corporate genius. Our guy is, though, taking over TheStreet.com. He turned it all around, and now he's on to yet another venture, which I know he will be delighted to tell you all about. So here, to take a little stroll down media memory lane and a look into the future with maybe a tasty stock tip along the way, the incomparable Dave Callaway.
Thank you, David. Boston Braves, huh? You didn't also cover the trade of Ruth to the Yankees, did you? David has been one of my oldest and dearest friends and mentor when I was a young reporter at Bloomberg, and he was a seasoned editor in the New York Bureau. Thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be among such distinguished journalists. I like nothing more than to be in a group with journalists, a room with a group of journalists, and especially at this festive time of year, with all the holiday traditions of the lights and the lunches and the parties and impeachment votes. If we're lucky, this will become an annual tradition. We'll see. Anyway, I'm honored to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of our craft and where I think that it's going. Last month, the editor of the campus paper at my alma mater, Northwestern University, made national headlines for publicly apologizing for his journalists doing their jobs. Troy Clausen, a 21-year-old student and editor of the Northwestern Daily, had sent his team to cover a speech by former FBI head Jeff Sessions, which was predictably protested, even though the university was not prepared. Protesters broke into the speech area and interrupted the speech. Clausen's team from the Daily took photos for the paper and its website and called student protesters afterward for comment. The next day, the Daily found itself in the center of a firestorm of controversy after students complained that the photos violated their right to privacy. The protesters. And that the journalists had no right to call them on their cell phones and look up their numbers in the public student directory. The story went national after Clausen, the editor, tried to diffuse the situation by issuing a written apology to the protesters and the students, which triggered basically every editor in America jumping on him from a great height. What's fascinating about this story, to me, is not that a young student journalist made a mistake. It's that so many students at a prestigious university haven't the slightest idea what journalists do, or even what their own First Amendment rights are in our society. A similar situation happened at Harvard earlier this year, the Crimson, and one at the University of Missouri a few years back. The damage done to a democracy by an uninformed public can be fatal. That our next generation is so woefully ignorant about how the press works not only worries me about our future, but about the whole democracy. This ignorance correlates, I believe, to some of the stunning reports we've seen in the last couple of weeks about President Trump's polls actually rising in battleground states as the impeachment vote nears. Now, time was when many of us were the age of these students, and we all wanted to be journalists. I got my first newspaper job as a copy boy at the New York Daily News in 1983, only a decade after Watergate. Everyone wanted to be a journalist, meet shadowy sources in garages underground, bring down a president. Let's go. At the time, the news boasted the 5th largest circulation in the country, more than 750,000 copies a day. The newsroom up on 42nd Street, many of you might remember, was electric and vast. One of my duties as a copy boy was try to beg, coax, or pry copy out of Jimmy Breslin every night on deadline. And so I would timidly enter his smoke-filled office to say that the city desk was waiting for him. He would scream some obscenities at me, tell them where to go, and send me out without the copy. I would go back to the city desk. They would say, "You tell that fat bastard to get paid," blah, blah, blah. And, after 3 or 4 times coming back and forth, I finally managed to grab a page or a page and a half to keep them happy. I fell in love with journalism that summer and the whole life of the newspaper reporter. One of the jobs I had was to travel out to Yankee Stadium or Shea Stadium every night with one of the photographers and then rush back film for late edition. And I just thought this was the coolest thing ever. I was sitting in the press booth with the photographers and the reporters. I was hooked. Yet even then, some 36 years ago, the veterans in the newsroom told me the glory days of the craft had already gone, and that the future for kids like me and all journalists was bleak. 3.5 decades later, I stand before you in the latter part of the best career I could have possibly imagined, which included reporting on the 1980 stock market crash, the troubles in Northern Ireland, the dawn of the euro currency, the death of Princess Diana. I directed coverage for 9/11 for CBS MarketWatch, and like many of you, met prime ministers, presidents, covered protests, killings, terror attacks, elections, inaugurations, new products that changed the world, and the rise and fall of great companies and leaders. In short, a career of travel and adventure and writing and editing. Nothing better. No part of it was boring or bleak, like the elder veterans had predicted for me. So when I look out today and I see my colleagues telling young journalism students and college students to pursue a career in something else, it makes me sad. The world needs journalists more than ever. A combination of social media and fake news with strong-armed tyrants like Trump, Duterte, Erdogan, MBS, or Putin make our existence even more essential. And within that vortex lies the opportunity. The secret is to be open to it, to be flexible about it, to not bemoan where we were, but look forward to where we're going. When I was about 30 years old and still working at the Boston Herald, I got a call from a new upstart news organization called Bloomberg Business News. They reached out and asked if I wanted to work for them in their New York office. I explained to them that I was from New York, and I was actually looking for my next gig to be something overseas, and that I had already started talking with Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, which owned the Herald at the time, about some sort of trip over to Australia or something like that. The next day, Bloomberg sent me an offer to join it in his London office. There I learned about electronic news, real-time news and alerts, something completely alien from what I had been doing at the newspaper in Boston. A new dawn was breaking in business journalism. Mike remembers. Mike was leading it, actually. And I was on the cusp of the wave. 5 years after that, I joined CBS MarketWatch in San Francisco. We built an internet version of Bloomberg, complete with foreign correspondents in 15 countries. We sold it to Dow Jones in 2005. The point is that the way to travel and adventure in journalism, then and now, was to be flexible and to reach for those opportunities in changing technologies and how news is produced and displayed. The demand for core news is still there, even greater than it used to be, even more fast-paced. But we have to be open to the way that opportunities are developing. My concern is that we in this room and collectively are not doing enough to illustrate to young minds the romanticism of journalism anymore. It was easier with papers and printing presses as props, but it's still possible. Journalists are now, often around the world considered spies or propagandists. At best, low-life morons at worst. Whose fault is that? I think of journalists and my colleagues as rock stars, and I want to get people thinking about that again. Until earlier this year, I was the president of the World Editors Forum, a group of 30 editors from 30 different countries, which meets a few times a year in different international cities to discuss the state of our profession and how we can help each other. It's particularly helpful for those editors in places like Turkey, Mexico, Philippines, or India, whose reporters are under attack from the government, often in physical danger. International outcry from groups like ours helped fuel the popular anger in Malta when a crusading journalist was blown up in her car 2 years ago. That anger is now coming close to toppling the government. When we meet, we go around the room discussing the various challenges in media freedom, business innovation, etc., Facebook, Google, and how our reporters are doing in the various countries under various media restrictions. I usually draw the biggest laugh because all I have to do is raise my hand and say Trump. Right? But we all agree that we need to collectively fight back, or these leaders will seek to divide us even further from society, a society that is not paying enough attention to what we do. It's a worthy cause and one that I'm happy to engage with. In the last 8 years, I've had the honor of being the editor-in-chief of USA Today, where we rebuilt the newsroom into a digital powerhouse that became, for a time, the 4th largest digital news operation in the U.S. I then became CEO here in New York of TheStreet, a long-ago competitor of CBS MarketWatch that had suffered on hard times. We turned it around and sold it earlier this year. Now my attentions are turning to what I think will be the next great adventure in journalism, chronicling the battle to save this planet over the next 30 years. Few of us expected climate change to get so bad so fast. I have a home outside of San Francisco, which for the last 2 years has been on the front line of the fires burning, fires that are appearing everywhere these days. Part of it was the nature of the reporting on it, often very scientific, sometimes too political, but not focused at least on what is happening and how quickly it's happening, and more importantly, how to stop it. The future is here now. Climate change has arrived. It's not something that's going to come in 10 or 15 years. It's only going to get worse from here. And we can't count on governments to lead us out of this and fix it. Look at what just happened in Madrid. I believe an army of young innovators, millennial leaders, engineers, and visionaries are going to spring up in the next few decades to devise ways to help us adapt to the coming changes. From plastic-eating technologies to clean oceans to dramatic improvements in energy distribution to offset oil and coal. This move, as I said, in the 80s, 70s, everyone wanted to be a journalist. In the 80s, everyone wanted to be a banker. In the 90s, everyone wanted to be on the internet. This move, I believe now we're seeing the young people come up, and they want to do something tied to social impact, and often that means climate change. Climate change is going to, at its heart, be a migratory story, as vast tracts of land currently inhabited in places like India, Africa, and Australia become uninhabitable. Some say the rising oceans on the American coastlines will soon make Duluth, Minnesota, the most attractive place to live in America. Go Vikings. Large parts of India, Africa, Australia are already facing disaster. Those of you who've read the headlines from Sydney say that the fires are just really on the outskirts of the city. It may be the first city that has to evacuate. In Indonesia, they are moving the capital because of climate change. Places like Venice and Miami and in South Africa are going to have to make dramatic changes. And the New York Times itself just reported a couple of weeks ago that a lot of homeowners in the Florida Keys have been told you're on your own. To which at least one of them said in your story, Well, does that mean I don't have to pay taxes anymore? Many large news organizations, Times, Guardian, Reuters, AP, Bloomberg, are dramatically shifting their resources to cover this phenomenon, and several digital newsletters and websites have sprung up in the US, Europe, and Asia to cover climate change policy in these regions. But the beat, if you can call it that, is still young. Every generation, a handful of new news organizations emerge that cover something that's already being covered better or differently with different technologies. It's been done many times before. CNN on television, Bloomberg, ESPN, Politico, even CBS MarketWatch. The next generation of young journalists, with this massive story as a backdrop, will not disappoint. Even more today than when we were all young. Students want to be part of something that changes the world. They want to be part of something that makes the world better. We need to make sure that they see journalism as a path toward doing that, as an exciting and rewarding career in an industry that just happens to be going through another one of its periods of wrenching changes. I had dinner with a hedge fund manager a few nights ago who confidently predicted that journalism as we know it will be dead in 2 years. Where's this guy getting his information? He manages millions of dollars. He's getting it from other hedge fund managers. People that have been buying into these companies seeking to bleed everything that we've created out of them in order to make a buck. The sharks are circling, Gannett, Gatehouse, Tribune, McClatchy. These are dangerous times for what we call the old guard. But there's a new guard developing, and that's where the action is going to be for these young kids. Axios, we mentioned, The Athletic in sports. They're always changing. It's so tempting to think that the old, the Journal and the Times have been around for 100 years. A lot of them, the others have come and gone, and new news organizations will come and go, and they'll be successful. That's where the excitement's going to be, I believe, and I'm hoping to play a role in it. Thank you.
David has agreed to take a not inconsiderable number of questions, and I'm sure you all have. And guess who will be manning the mics? Mike.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I followed that story, and I also followed another story about
Which one, the Northwestern one?
the one that you talked about, the Northwestern
Yes.
one. But there was another story about an author who, there was an article in the school paper and quoted someone who had said that she joined the committee to decide which books were going to be read for freshmen, and the way she was quoted, I'm sure that's what she said, but she said that a particular author whose name I can't remember, but who's quite well known, writes quote unquote young adult fiction, and this particular college student who joined the committee did not think that her work was up to the standards of other work for a college level course, and was quoted by some student journalist as saying that she had joined this committee just to make sure that this particular author was not chosen. Well, talk about a firestorm. It was a huge firestorm, and yeah, I would like to know what you think about it. The question, well, I have to finish one thing to ask you what you think about it, because you were talking about how Northwestern immediately apologized and blah, 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 blah. Well, this college, it was in the South somewhere. Well, first of all that she posted this on her website, and all her colleagues came in and started trashing this poor young girl who was the student, and then the university ultimately issued an apology to the author. So I'd just like to,
Well, first of all, it wasn't Northwestern that apologized. It was the editor of the paper. That's what created the firestorm. what's happening with the journalists and the newspapers on these universities is an extension of a broader problem that you have just identified, which is that the students, and in some cases faculty, are trying to take control of what is being taught, and they're using a political lens to do that. That's what happened at the University of Missouri, actually, and that is extremely dangerous. I think these universities are supposed to be places to go to open your mind, right? Not to be told that you're going to study a conservative agenda or a liberal agenda or whatever. So anything that moves towards censorship, obviously, I'm against. Probably agreed with it with everyone in this room.
Hi, we all know climate change and what effect is really important. Schools of journalism and undergraduate programs in journalism aren't pushing it. They're more concerned about me, it, they, them, we. One day I'm he, one day I'm she. How do we get a generation of journalists to care about and get the schools to encourage coverage that's not just crime, sexual identity, but deals with climate control, that's not just that's not part of business, it's not part of entertainment, it's not part of all of the curriculum. I work with a lot of universities. They don't want to deal with it.
Right.
How do we get there?
It's it's distressing to hear that said, because those students want to deal with it. They want to be part of it. And the student journalists need an avenue to basically release their ambitions in that. And so I think it's the duty of the journalism school. Like, journalism schools have developed many ways over 30 years. They're now, when I was younger, they were just only starting to teach what broadcast journalism was, right? There's all sorts of different types of journalism you can go into now and study at the schools. And I think climate and environmental journalism is going to become a core thing. And so if we need news organizations that are hiring journalists that have a passion for that outlet, and we're starting to see it, but that's why I think there's a huge opportunity in this space.
Dave, let's get to your old employer, Bloomberg. What do you think about Mike Bloomberg telling his people they can't cover the presidential campaign?
So I was saying at the table earlier that I had a drink with a couple of my old Bloomberg buddies here in New York last night, and I put it to one of them who's fairly high up, and he said they had essentially a vigorous debate about the pros and cons of whether they should do this, and then were told by Mike what they were going to do. And so, I think it's horrible. I think, how can you do that? I was at Dow Jones when Rupert made his bid for the company. Paul Steiger, who we all know, had a team of reporters covering that bid and covering Rupert. That's the only way to maintain credibility. Now, you can understand the argument inside of Bloomberg that, well, no one's going to believe us anyway if we do a story on Mike's past, sexual harassment stories, whatever. We're not going to be believed anyway, so why bother doing it? That totally misses the point in my book. You have to bother doing it. You have to be out there if you're going to be viewed as a credible news organization. And I don't think what they're looking forward to is, what if he wins? I mean, how are they going to cover President Bloomberg if he tells them that they're not? And so he, as much as I love him as my ex-employer and as a candidate, I think he's establishing a really, really dangerous precedent. And, by extension, we've all noticed that there is a series of somewhat wealthy people who have now bought many newspapers. What's to prevent Jeff Bezos from doing something like that, right? No, that's a good point. He is not. Yeah. He's not.
To Jeff Bezos' credit, when his divorce and that whole Michigas came out, he stayed away from the Washington Post newsroom, and he let...
which was the right thing to do. But you see, there's other people taking over papers. They see Mike do this, they figure... Anyway. Yeah. I think, look, if he becomes president, I think he will revisit the decision, but I don't know which way he'll go.
Maybe he'll actually dispense with, actually put his... Give him the mic, Mike, give him the mic. What did you just say?
you make an interesting point about this big discussion inside Bloomberg. Is it worth resigning from the company because you feel that they've distorted the ethics of journalism?
I think that is each journalist's choice. I think if Bezos tried to do it at the Post, there would be a mass resignation. That's really, we'll see if that happens. If you do see it, Mike, you'll see it happen obviously in the Washington Bureau. And I must say that I know a couple of journalists who have resigned over the past over something similar edicts that have gone down.
I'm just picking up on the last thing that you said before the questioning, and you said, I hope to participate in this. So my question is, exactly how? What are you plotting, and what do you hope to do?
Well, I've had a lot of fun as editor-in-chief of a big news operation. I enjoyed being CEO of a company and turning it around and helping the shareholders. I decided afterwards that I enjoy being an editor more. And so what I would like to do is to create a small news operation, newsletter, if you will, using kind of one of the modern templates like Axios or The Athletic, that would cover climate change from an innovative and investment-oriented focus on a global basis. And so I'm working on something like that.
Would you be focusing on the science or the politics?
The business. So if you're on Wall Street these days, you have dramatic pressure from your shareholders to invest in climate change. If you're CEO, you're trying to understand, what's my climate change? You ask your marketing department, what's my climate change policy, right? Shareholders are demanding that corporations do a lot more to invest in it. Wall Street is in big investment banks, and fund managers are raising lots of money in new venture funds. All this money that's being raised, irrespective of where Trump is, or Brazil is, or Portugal is, or China is gonna go into innovative technologies. And I think over some point, over the next several years, you're gonna start to see a new wave of entrepreneurs, and like we saw on the internet 15 years ago, they're gonna be tied into some of these technologies. Money's gonna be fueling them, and it's gonna become, climate change to date has often been somewhat of a chore to read about. And people don't like being dictated to or told that they got to do this, right? Yeah. If it becomes an opportunity for them, I think we're going to start to see things move a lot faster. I think there's going to be a whole new industry, as there was in the internet industry in the 90s and the social media, as there was in investment banking, that's going to crop up around this. And so I'd like to be part of the new industry of journalism organizations that are covering it.
What do you think is the most undercovered story of the next election cycle?
Wow. Of the next election cycle here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Well, I mean, I think climate change is right up there. I don't think people are really not talking about it at all. Talking about Trump and Trump's taxes. Immigration, that's a really good question, and one of those things you don't know until it actually comes up. But I would put, since I'm focusing mostly on climate change and the environment, I think it's completely uncovered, because as the Trump administration has turned its back on it over the last 4 years, we've seen 4 years of dramatic increase in the level of devastation. Somebody said, there was a book written, which I read a little bit, that said the world has done more damage to its environment since the opening pilot of Seinfeld than it had in the previous 400 million years. That is our generation, right? And that's no wonder Greta is so angry. So, I think Trump's doing a lot of things. We've got to worry about what he's doing with the judiciary. I mean, unless you're a big fan of his, right? We got to worry about what's going on with the judiciary, immigration, world stage, everything. And I have some friends through my editor's group in Europe from Serbia. And they were talking the other day, and they said, you guys don't understand. He said, the leaders that were running Serbia during the Civil War 25 years ago didn't all get arrested. Milosevic got arrested, but most of them just went into opposition and are now back in charge. And they've figured out a way to become more corrupt and rewrite the country's laws in a way that doesn't involve violence, but is kind of hidden beneath the surface. He said if you elect Trump to win, the damage he's going to do to your democratic ideals and rights over the following 4 years are going to be more devastating than you could possibly imagine. So, there's all of that, but a long answer to your question, I think, the climate change gets lost in these discussions because it's not as sexy as,
Back here.
right?
Back here.
All right, Mike, sorry.
Yeah, I understand that there are something like 40 plus rating agencies that are trying to assess climate change risk. So I'm just wondering, in your thinking about climate change, if any of them seem to be on the right track, or are rating or assessment efforts that you think are valid. And then I did hear something about a stock tip. So are there any companies that you think are going to that are going to benefit from this risk, climate change risk, that you're going to be looking at?
Not that there are going to be a ton of them, not that are public right now. A lot of the insurance companies are obviously trying to measure the risk. Part of the problem is the lack of metrics, right? You can go onto a computer today and figure out what your carbon footprint is, kind of vaguely put in how many times a week you eat meat, do you live in a house, do you have 2 cars, and it'll throw up an estimate, right? You can't determine how that would affect you today versus tomorrow, right? Imagine if we could determine how companies' carbon footprints are going day to day. Those metrics don't exist yet, but they will. And this is where the risk measurement folks, like the ratings companies and insurance companies, are going to be throwing a lot of money into.
First of all, I want to thank you for this wonderful talk. It really is fabulous. I think the biggest problem we face putting climate change on people's schedule, on their heads, is its long-term thinking. And we're in a short-term thinking world where everything's moving so fast and fast and fast. How do we get people out of the short-term mentality and into a greater sense of understanding that the path forward is grim?
Yeah, I think that in many ways climate change is doing that for us. I've been thinking about this idea for a long time, and I mentioned it to one of my mentors about 7 years ago, and he said, do you think there's enough news to cover? And that was just 7 years ago. Now it's on the front page most days. And if you live in California, it's happening to you. If you live in Australia, it's happening to you. If you live in Miami, it's happening to you. These people are suddenly losing their homes and being forced to leave town. There's 100 million people in India that might not be able to exist where they live right now next summer, with temperatures getting up above 129 degrees. And we don't really see that. And someone was mentioning to me before, we're not really spending a lot of time thinking about what's going on in Sydney right now. Major global city under threat. Cape Town almost ran out of water last year. This stuff is happening, and it tends to focus the mind. Otherwise, I think people will just put it off, and that's why we haven't developed the metrics, the coverage, the willpower to date to combat it. But I think that's going to happen. And it's so easy to blame the press that it's the press's fault. I think the press reflects what's going on in society. And if society is not caring about it, is not going to read the stories, it's easy to push those stories away. As society becomes more and more, I will say this: the rise in the coverage that we've seen in just the last 10 to 12 months is a reflection of society's interest in those stories.
Yes, but Dave, I was at COP21 in Paris, actually writing for the USA Today op-ed page at that time. You may recall.
It's a brilliant decision.
Right. And I remember back then. I mean, the world press was there. I mean, it was an amazing gathering. Heads of state from all over the world, heads of government from all over the world. It was like, it was a really an electric atmosphere, and there was an agreement that came out that everybody signed on to, that everybody agreed to. Turn to COP25 in Madrid this year. There was nobody there. I mean, there were obviously a lot of people, but there was nobody there. None of the major world media covered this at all. There was no television. There was no, the major newspapers buried the story, basically. And yet, the issue has become ever more dangerous and pressing since then. If we can't get the governments of the world to focus on this, and the major journalists to focus on it, what's it going to take to actually break through and recreate that atmosphere that was at COP21 that seemed to electrify everybody then, and then just fell by the wayside?
That's a good point, David. I think COP21, these types of events where the world leaders come and they stage a photo op and they sign a document pledging something that none of them are ever going to. It's not specialized to climate change. It happens many different areas. I think COP25 was a huge disappointment, and people are just backtracking. Because the world has moved away from globalization and is moving into its own little smaller worlds. That is why I don't believe that governments are going to lead us out of this. Right? Governments didn't create the technology boom of the 1990s. Governments didn't create the auto boom. Innovators and inventors and personable folks like Steve Jobs and Henry Ford and stuff, they created these industries, and that is what I think where the stories are going to be, as people take it into their own hands to create these technologies from little, there's one company, I don't have the name for you, but they've actually created something that can eat the plastic in the ocean and hold it into an area where that can then be recovered. Which would, that's a major breakthrough. So it's going to be at the grassroots level.
You said before that if Bezos were to issue a kind of edict in the way that Bloomberg did, there'd be a mass walkout at the Washington Post. What's different about the people who work at Bloomberg?
Well, I followed that up by saying that I personally know a couple of the journalists in Washington who walked out a couple years ago when they dramatically drew back their Bloomberg.gov, their government coverage, for the same way. They imposed some restrictions on how they were to cover certain areas of the government, particularly stuff that Mike was interested in, and these people walked out. So there's not anything different. These are world-class journalists operating on a world stage. How many of you have worked at Bloomberg? A couple of folks, right? So you know what I'm talking about. They're A-level journalists, but they're all covering different things. And my guess is it would be the people on the front lines in politics who would walk out. At the Washington Post, they cover many different things. Also, the people who would resign would be the political folks, and right up to Marty Barron, I believe. So, I don't think it has to do with whether they're different journalists or not, but it does have to do with kind of the way they're covering stuff.
But it hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened this time yet, but we'll see. It's still fresh.
Dave, you said you worked for Murdoch in Boston. What do you think his influence has been on American journalism?
Oh, that's a great question, Mike. So I've known Rupert for a long time. I worked for him in Boston. He bought Dow Jones when I was at Dow Jones, and under his leadership at Dow Jones, I was able to build MarketWatch from a group that had 5 international bureaus to 15. In many ways using the News Corp offices worldwide. So he's been nothing but good in terms of expansion. Obviously, when you worked for Rupert, You know how he feels. He doesn't issue edicts like Mike Bloomberg does. He just says how he feels and then lets the ripple effect go down through the rest of the operation. He never messed with any of the stuff we were doing in Boston, in New York. I never saw him, actively mess around with headlines in the Wall Street Journal. He certainly dictated new sections and stuff. But frankly, these folks, Mike and Rupert and stuff, they've created journalism jobs. And I can't look down on people that create journalism jobs. There's enough of them out there trying to take journalism jobs. So, if Rupert wants to discuss headlines and talk about newspapers and lose $30 million a year at the New York Post, he's creating jobs for journalists and my friends and colleagues, and I think it's a good thing.
With all due respect, hold on, I'm
It's a
speaking.
tough crowd.
All due respect, I've worked for Rupert for 3 years as business editor of the New York Post. He never interfered with me once, but he created a news network that helped create a president who has done more damage to the media and to what we believe in journalism than anybody else in history.
Yeah, I was really thinking about Rupert there on the newspapers around the world. Fox News is its own monster. I don't support it. I know people that work there as journalists and are trying to do the best they can as journalists under the pressure of the hand there. It's easy to say Roger did a lot of that, but Rupert let it happen. And at the same time, he saw a business opportunity and created an amazing business operation, which we can argue has really hurt America, and half the folks that watch Fox News would say it hasn't. So, I particularly and personally believe that Fox has been very hurtful to society, but it is what it is.
Refresh my memory. How did Bloomberg News cover Mayor Mike Bloomberg?
How did what?
How did Bloomberg News cover Mayor Mike
The
Bloomberg?
same thing. When Mike announced that he was running for mayor, he said no coverage. And when he became mayor, he said no coverage. Now, I want you, this is an important distinction inside the newsroom. No coverage doesn't mean you can't mention him in any stories, right? If the New York Times breaks a story about Bloomberg's finances, they're going to cover that, right? What they mean is they're not going to actively investigate him, right?
But they covered the city government.
They covered the seat of government. They covered the mayor. They covered all the scandals and this, but they didn't actively, chase him around to investigate him, the person.
David, to pass a Trump.
Oh, hi. First, thank you for your comment. I bought the Post. I moved to New York in 1980. I loved the Post. It was a fun, sensational paper. I haven't bought much. I bought 2 copies in the last 3 years, and you can guess why. The defensive denials that come out of that, the so-called news side, have really lessened my esteem. And believe me, it's 3 years out of it's been 35 years I was buying the Post. And I just was entertained. I loved it. I bought it for sports. I bought it for crime, for editorials, even editorials, but not in the last 3 years. I refuse to. I won't watch Fox. I have to watch it for the football games on Sunday. Otherwise, I wouldn't turn on any part of the Fox network. And I find what's happened to our world in the last 4 years since a certain announced candidate has been a shock. And I was going to ask you about, what do you think about the morons at Sinclair?
It is scary as hell. All of those companies, I think are in the process of becoming something else and withering. The Gannett Gatehouse merger that we just saw essentially was done to buy 3 years worth of runway while they still try to figure out what to do. But you can't, owning a bunch of newspapers that were all had fabulous profit margins was a great business in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Owning a bunch of newspapers that are losing money is not a good business. And then merging with a bigger company that owns a bunch of papers that are losing money, all it really does is buys everybody about 3 years. It's sad. I think what's going on at Sinclair, I think McClatchy Tribune is in real danger. So it's, but these companies are not the future. There are your perennials, the New York Times and the Journal, the Post. Some would argue the LA Times, but the other companies are going to go up and down, and these companies that were created among many newspapers are going to deal with some hard times.
Wait, before we let Arthur Sulzberger go, Arthur, are you ever going to sell the New York Times? Please tell us no.
How many times have I had to say no? I mean, I've said no for the last 30 years.
Okay, we're happy
Thank
to hear
you. Thanks, Arthur. Good to see you.
If we get Trump's tax returns before the election, do you think it's going to have an impact?
Obviously, it depends what's in them, but I don't. Right? His audience doesn't care, and they don't care about the impeachment. They don't care about anything that he does that we find so reprehensible. Part of me wonders if they're just some sort of great head fake, and that we'll suddenly see them and they won't be a big deal. I mean, the Times did a great job covering them. Dave Barstow, who I went to school with, did this 50,000-word expose on Trump's finances and stuff, and showed that he hadn't paid taxes since 1984, and essentially he just claimed losses the whole time. And that story just dropped like a thud. Nobody followed it the next day or anything. That, I think, unless it comes out that he's, got some, he's paying every woman in Bangkok, to stay quiet, and even that, I don't know if that would help. I mean, who knows? I don't think they were gonna. I'm not sure you're gonna get a lot out of him.
But Dave, the one thing that could is if at the same time that those tax returns come out, suddenly the stock market begins to turn around, and we really do begin heading towards a recession of some kind. Is that not the chink that would really finally perhaps penetrate a large percentage?
The stock market would turn around based on whether the taxes had something big in them, right? If they don't, it's not going to turn around. Look, we are in the 11th year of an amazing bull market, unprecedented in its length. And if you're looking for stock tips, it's almost, you don't need to. Just buy the S&P 500 fund, and you're up 28% this year. That's not going to last forever. And I think if Trump, I think it will. I was one of the early folks saying we'd have a recession by now, but the signs just continue to show that the economy remains strong. People will vote their pocketbook, and if Trump says, I created 7 million jobs and the stock market's strong, and there's, that's going to be very hard to defeat him. But the stock market will bust, and likely it might even bust after he's elected. So we'll see.
Following up on that, over here.
Yes.
Following up on that, if the stock returns show, and the files from Deutsche Bank, if they show that all of the loans that he had were guaranteed by Russian oligarchs, if they show that all of his stuff was propped up by Russians over the last 10 and 15 years, which his son admitted to Gulf Digest a few years back, which just seems to have gone like a thud. But to a decent reporter at Gulf Digest said, in Scotland, where did you get all the money for this? And he said, we get all the money we need from Russians. Don't you think that the Republicans out there in mid-America will get that?
I think they will get it. I'm not sure how much they will care. That's the problem. It's I'm sure that his projects were all financed by Russians. Every project he did in the 1980s went bankrupt. No American bank would touch him, right? So that's why he's using Deutsche Bank and the Russian oligarchs. Those oligarchs funded every investment in the UK in the last 25 years. That's no doubt. So if that comes out, I can see that happening. I can see us all doing the headlines, and then I can see people saying, "So what? That doesn't mean he's a spy for Putin." That's what we're dealing with.
Dave, I have a question and then one more after me. I've been covering business news in Wall Street even longer than you. I always told my wife the stock market hates uncertainty. Well, for the last 3 years, she says to me, what's been more uncertain than the situation we're in now? Why has the stock market prospered so much in this period of uncertainty?
Well, I think, Mike, it's a combination of the tax cut and the move to roll back the Obama regulations, which came post-financial crisis, right? You've created running room for the banks to do things, lend again, but also take risks again. You've rolled back all of the energy and environmental regulations, and that has allowed big business to boom in probably dangerous ways. So, frankly, there's no uncertainty there. We would know. Business could be reminded that if Trump wins re-election, it's going to be another 4 years of party time. That will ultimately lead to a disaster, but who knows when.
Last question. Good one. Here we go, Mike. Oh, here.
To follow up on that, do you think that the Saudis and other supporters of Trump have been artificially supporting the stock market, or is it just the lack of regulation of various industries has created an opportunity where the crooks shall reign?
I think the lack of regulation has created an opportunity where a lot of money has been coming in. There's always some crooked activity going on in a scenario like that, but you've got a situation where China's slowing down. The rest of Asia is uncertain. Europe is wrapped in Brexit turmoil. Hasn't been a lot of other places to invest, and so global money has found its way into the U.S. But it's not as sinister as the Saudis propping it up. They don't have that much money to prop it up. It's a massive market, but there's a lot of money coming in from everywhere because that's where the returns have been.
What about Paul Krugman's column that Trump has been totally conned by the Chinese?
Possible. I think the Chinese believe they have conned him. I'm sure the Saudis believe that. I'm sure the Russians believe that. I'm sure a lot of folks that deal with him like that believe that. Do we really think if we do a deal with China that they're going to just start behaving again? This is one of Trump's kind of masterpieces. He can string this deal along right before the election and then engineer a big move in the market a month before the election. But whether China would follow it, I highly doubt it.
Okay. Well, how optimistic. A great note to end on. David, thank you. It was just a masterful tour d'horizon. And everybody, come back after the holidays in January. We will have the inside dope on Brett Kavanaugh. Thanks to Mike Candell. Okay, folks. Bye.